Today, we're launching a new show on Game Soup, Short Form Analysis, where we'll focus on taking bite-sized looks at the game industry. This episode is all about DLC. If you Google DLC, this is the first image you'll be shown. Ask the average gamer what their thoughts on downloadable content, or DLC, are, and they'll likely verbalize the same points that this image makes. Downloadable content is something that most major gaming companies today take full advantage of, but it doesn't often sit well with consumers when that content fails to justify its purchase price. The rise of DLC is due to many interesting factors in the video game industry, and even if we don't agree with the practice, perhaps taking an objective, analytical viewpoint can help explain just how we ended up inserting DLC into our games. Companies have lots of very good incentives to produce DLC for their games, so if we can take a critical look at what those reasons might be, maybe we'll be better at discerning between justified DLC releases and cynical money grabs. Right off the top, there are a few factors that I want to explore here: industry maturation, the internet and technical unlimitation, and scope creep. Let's start with industry maturation. The gaming industry is still in its infancy when compared to television, film, and the printed word. The home console market began in 1972 with the release of the Magnavox Odyssey. In other words, video games as we know them have been around for less than 50 years, while television, which got its start in the late 1930s, has had almost double the time to mature and fill a previously undiscovered niche in the economy. So if we accept that video games as a whole are still immature as an industry, it's not illogical to say that trying out new or innovative business models is just part of the growing pains of gaming. We've seen motion controls, VR, and countless other attempts to revolutionize the standard model of gaming, but they can't all succeed. The truth of the matter is that the video games industry has rarely seen long-term stability since its inception. There was the infamous video game crash in the 80s, followed by Nintendo's NES being the predominant force on the market for an extended period. Most children growing up during the SNES and Sega Genesis era felt as if these were the two big players in the industry. Not until the release of the Xbox did the games industry have three stable hardware producers all competing in the same game space. In other words, while there are currently considered to be 8 gaming generations, only in the last 3 have we had anything resembling a fair market with more than 2 serious competitors. The games industry experiences complete change from its foundation upwards every few years when a new console generation begins. Each new generation can incorporate technology that may have not even been possible just 5 years before. Remember the Sega Channel? It was an add-on for the Sega Genesis that connected to a primitive internet, allowing you to play Sega Genesis games and get cheat codes. This all happened in 1994, and while it was revolutionary, it didn't become a market leader and was eventually discontinued 4 years later in 1998. The failure of the Sega Channel and any other experimental business model represent the growing pains of an industry that isn't yet sure how to present itself. Really, the Sega Channel was the first big DLC on the market, but it wasn't what the market wanted. Fast forward to 1999, when the Dreamcast launched with a built-in 56K modem, because internet access was quickly becoming the standard with any highly advanced technological product. The point here is that the current state of DLC is a way for game companies to experiment with business and revenue models, but just like the Sega Channel, there's no way to predict whether this will turn into a long-term addition to video games. We're not even certain whether game consoles will exist in a few more gaming generations, let alone physical game discs. But when developers realized they could charge money for extra content, it only made sense to pursue it as a way to bring in additional revenue. When plastic guitars and band simulators had their moment in the spotlight a few years ago, DLC really shined because it allowed for nearly limitless game content. For example, the original Rock Band has over $9,000 worth of DLC. Any game company looking to make their game more profitable would probably jump on the chance to offer additional content, even if it means getting only a few more dollars here and there from consumers. Even though we're not sure if the current state of DLC is necessarily indicative of a long-term reliance on the business model, we know that it's a necessary part of the industry finding its legs, so that future generations are even better. The second factor is something I want to call technical unlimitation, or in other words, progressively expanding potential. This ties in nicely with the industry maturation concept above. Before consoles made extensive use of the internet, the only way to further capitalize on an IP was to release another game in the series, ship it off to brick-and-mortar stores all over the world, and hope it sold well with promos and advertising. Similarly, the only way to patch a game-breaking bug was to have consumers send in the defective game and send them a fixed copy in return. This method was in use as recently as Legend of Zelda: Twilight Princess. But thanks to the internet, all of this is obsolete. Not only can our games be patched while we sleep, but popular franchises like Call of Duty and Street Fighter have become much more malleable. The state that a game ships in is no longer an indication of the long-term state of that game's quality. If a Street Fighter title launches with 12 fighters, but DLC allows for an additional 12, then it won't take 3 more years of development to get those new characters into an upgraded version of the same game. In essence, we're squeezing more value out of each individual game, whereas before the ubiquity of the internet, we were releasing a lot of games but only squeezing a fraction of the value out of them. Just 10 years ago, it was pretty uncommon to see day-zero patches, consistent updates to game content, whether free or as paid DLC, and a very open line of communication between developers and consumers. But all of these things are the standard fare for games today. The internet has allowed for feedback to be transmitted and received faster than ever, meaning that developers can be more efficient with each game they release, by listening to their fans. More importantly, this makes pushing updates to existing franchises and games not only possible, but profitable for both developers and gamers. It's the same logic with expansion packs. There's no need to create a brand new entry in a game series if you can work with what you already have in some form. DLC is sometimes seen as a replacement for the traditional expansion pack, but because it's added piecemeal instead of all at once, a game-breaking bug that might cripple the game experience can potentially be avoided or patched. Of course, all of this is well and good if it isn't abused, but that's frequently not the case. Many titles ship with content on the disc that's locked behind a DLC paywall. In my opinion, this is a flagrant abuse of the DLC system. If consumers are to become comfortable with and embrace the idea of DLC, it shouldn't be used with malintent by denying certain content that would otherwise be available. Only when DLC adds to already existing features and content should it be used. Anything else feels like a cheap cash grab or a punishment for early adopters of a game. Along with digital rights management, DLC is widely considered a drain on the gaming industry because its potential for misuse is so high, and there are no checks and balances in place to prevent this. The only way to tell developers this isn't okay is with your wallet. Or I guess you could send them an angry email or DDoS their website or something, but I'm not advocating that. Better technology essentially lets companies decide what business model they want to pursue. Grand Theft Auto 5 might be $60 right off the shelf and bring in $60 million if 1 million people buy it, but that's a one-time cash flow. If the game was instead free, but had built-in DLC and microtransactions, cash would flow for years and years after the game's release. And it's hard to imagine a scenario where, at least strictly in terms of revenues, that the DLC approach isn't more profitable. You can place pretty much every video game within a spectrum of cash grabability. On one end, you have a pure cash grab that offers next to no content, see Final Fantasy All the Bravest. On the other hand, you might have a pay-up-front game like Grand Theft Auto 5 that relies strictly on the sale of the game disc itself to bring in money. The goal when using DLC and microtransactions is sliding as far to the left as possible without upsetting fans or offering a subpar experience. Since the industry is still so immature, we're exploring this spectrum and discovering new combinations of revenue models, so there are bound to be bumps along the way as we move forward. Finally, scope creep makes DLC a viable and almost necessary part of many game development cycles. Once again, this ties into the technical unlimitation idea above. Now that updates can be pushed anytime after a game launches, there's no hard limit on the amount of content that developers can add. This is useful because games have become more expensive to produce than ever. But it's also dangerous, making the scope of a project so large that it eventually becomes too costly or ambitious to continue. DLC can help keep scope creep to a minimum during development by getting only the core game out. Other features can always be added later once a fanbase is established. As our games get larger and more realistic, the team developing a AAA title could include hundreds of full-time workers. Resident Evil 6 had 600 people working on it, and for all their efforts, the game was received poorly. Sonic Adventure for the Dreamcast had a team of only 30. Finally, Cave Story was made by only a single person. If you had to make a choice between hiring 600 new developers to start from scratch on the next Resident Evil, or keeping the same crew to work on new content in the already existing RE6 for a few months to a year, chances are it's more efficient for both your time and money to add content to an existing framework. Game developers are going all in on gigantic dev teams and top-of-the-line assets. When DLC is done correctly, it can reward early adopters, entice reluctant customers, and generate positive will between us and them. Adding a costume pack for $12 that was already present on the game disc isn't the way to do this. Since the scope of video games has increased so dramatically, it's rare to see a mainstream success developed by just a few people. Workforces and budgets have increased, but even adjusting for inflation, the price of the average video game hasn't really increased in proportion over the decades. To keep up with inflation over the last 20 years, today's games should cost about $79 right off the shelf, but it hasn't happened. Apparently, it makes more sense to build in long-term revenue models rather than raising the upfront cost, and this starts to make a lot of sense looking at games today. Think about how good games can look and sound. Think about the amount of man-hours it takes to make a modern AAA title. We can make this easy to understand with an example. Final Fantasy XIII cost $70 million to develop, manufacture, and market. The game has sold well, and now its developer is presented with a choice. Should it continue to support the title, which already has a large fanbase, or should it start from scratch and drop another $70 million to work on a brand new entry in the franchise? Since the framework for content is already in place, you could produce the same amount of new content in your existing game with a fraction of the cost. You ever wonder why there are so many remakes and sequels in the movie industry? It might be for the same reason that DLC makes sense from a business perspective. You're giving consumers more of what they've explicitly told you with their wallet that they want from you. By working with existing assets, you're not only saving money on development costs, but you're producing content for a franchise with a built-in fanbase. It's hard to find objective numbers and statistics showing the exact impact that DLC has, but we know that it's brought in a lot of money from consumers. In 2014, EA projected DLC revenues of $1 billion. If the newest Assassin's Creed title will cost $100 million to develop, this DLC alone provides the capital for 10 new games. The revenues from DLC continue to climb as developers offer more and more options to appeal to players. Some developers buck the trend by offering free DLC. This is great because it discourages piracy to some extent by offering free updates. It also is a great way to gain consumer loyalty and confidence when other game companies are charging for similar content updates. It might not be as profitable up front, but it might be just as good in the long run. Unfortunately, we haven't had enough time to fully understand the ramifications of the ubiquity of DLC in the industry, whether free or paid. So these are just a few of the reasons that DLC is probably going to remain viable for a very long time. Chalk it up to a changing industry, but cost and profits are affected by countless factors today, from development to manufacturing to MSRPs and beyond. But the data so far show us that DLC is effective as a business model, and the numbers show us that consumers are willing to pay for it. So as long as the model isn't abused, it turns out to be a very effective way to not only appease customers with frequent updating, but also turn some tidy profits. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.